So this talk really is, and I'm off script now, this talk really is the latest installment of our Northern Ireland political collection lecture series. And I was just chatting to Rachel beforehand about how this lecture series really came about. For those who aren't familiar with the library or aren't familiar with our collections, the Northern Ireland Political Collection really is a complete archive, a complete record of the Northern Irish Trouble, what we call the Troubles here in Northern Ireland. A collection that was first started by our librarian back at that time in 1968 by the librarian Jimmy Vitti, who collected a civil rights leaflet in Belfast city centre and brought it back to the library. And since then, the library still to this day actively collects for that Northern Ireland political collection. Books, pamphlets, t-shirts, ephemera, everything, you name it, 350,000 pieces. It's the biggest, the most unique record archive of the Troubles in the world, completely unrivaled. And yet, to my mind, not as many people know about it as should know about it. And so the whole idea of this lecture series was that whenever I took the job on a couple of years ago, we really wanted to promote this Northern Ireland political collection through a lecture series. And the idea wasn't we were going to have a series of lectures bringing people in to talk about the Troubles. Far from it. The idea was that we would bring people in to do talks for us who had some sort of connection to the Northern Ireland political collection itself, whether they had donated an aspect of the collection, whether they had some role in a part of the collection, or whether they had used it for research themselves. And that's how we came along then to tonight's speaker, because Tony Novosel, who did a talk for us last October, I think it might have been, September, October, I think. Really popular talk by Tony Novosel about loyalism, and Tony had used the political collection extensively. But off the back of that, Tony has been able to recommend to us at least two other speakers. And one of them is joining us tonight, Dr. Rachel Oppenheimer, who's going to speak to us. Let me just get this title right. No Wash, the significance of Republican prison protest before the 1981 hunger strike. And as I say, this the idea of this wasn't to have a talk about the hunger strikes or about Republican prison protests, really. It was because Rachel has used and made extensive use of our political collection, and she's going to refer to some of that throughout the talk. So look, you've heard enough from me. I'm just going to hand over to Dr. Rachel Oppenheimer now, who's going to speak to us, I think, for about 50 minutes. And then at the end, if anybody has any questions, concerns, queries as we're going along through this talk, I would encourage you to direct them through the chat function at the bottom of your screen. I'll pick up any questions and then I will field those to Rachel at the very end. We'll maybe have 5 or 10 minutes to do that at the end. So look, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Rachel and she'll take us for the next 50 minutes or so. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Jason. Before I begin, I'd really just like to express my gratitude to all of you for coming in today. I want to thank Jason and the Lennon Hall Library for giving me the opportunity to speak today. Special shout out to Tony Novosel for foisting me on people all the time. I always have fun whenever that happens. As Jason said, I did research in the Northern Ireland political collection, both for my master's thesis and my dissertation, and have nothing but good things to say about that experience, and am very happy to have nothing but good things to say about this one as well. So thank you, everyone. In December of 1975, discussing the forthcoming removal of special category status in Northern Irish prisons, the Northern Ireland Office Director of Prison Operations noted, the PIRA representatives at HMP McGilligan have stated quite categorically that the withdrawal of special category status is seen as an important issue by those prisoners now enjoying that privilege, and they propose to frustrate our plans by any means, including force. He made assurances to people at the NIO that all of the prisons knew of this threat, that they were ready to meet anything that Republican prisoners might throw at them. In that, he was quite confident. That confidence waned as things progressed. Special category status for anyone who is unfamiliar, was granted in 1972, and it allowed prisoners sentenced for offenses related to the conflict to do things like wear their own clothes, to live in quarters with other members of their organizations. Men lived in the Nissen huts at Long Kesh, for example. They could structure their own time. The paramilitary hierarchies were observed, and they lived in a manner akin to prisoners of war, which they argued then was equivalent to political status. But by 1975, the direct rule government in Northern Ireland viewed special category status as a mistake, and they were prepared to do away with it then for any offenses committed after March 1st, 1976. They would subsequently treat sentenced combatants in the same manner as people convicted of offenses that were not related to the conflict, the so-called ODCs, or ordinary decent criminals. In other words, the IRA, the INLA, and loyalist prisoners would be criminalized. The protests against criminalization begun by Republicans with the blanket protest in 1976 and extending through the hunger strikes of 1980 and 1981 have been sort of unevenly studied, particularly amongst academics. The hunger strikes, particularly 1981, have received much of that attention, and there's good reason for that. But today, I'll discuss how important earlier protests were to Republicans' efforts to remove the stain of the criminal from their time in prison. If we look at hunger strikes for just a moment, they attacked criminalization by targeting officials in the highest echelons of the British government, threatening them with the stigma of prisoners' deaths to pressure them to reinstate special category status. The blanket and subsequent dirty protests, however, physically altered the prison regime from the very cells of prisoners themselves without waiting for the consent of government or guards. In denying that they were criminals, blanket and dirty protesters kick-started the crucial work of building outside support for prisoners' demands for political status. This would be mobilized extensively in the later hunger strikes. Their escalating protests also dictated day-to-day actions within the prisons, which resulted in widening fissures between prison staffs and the NIO, creating unsustainable levels of pressure. So my argument here is that to truly understand later, more widely known moments of Republican protest and how criminalization was ultimately undermined, we have to understand the blanket and dirty protests in both the H blocks and Armagh prison. Just a quick note here about the terminology that I'll use. Republicans really prefer the term no wash protest. I'm going to use both no wash and dirty protest today interchangeably to alleviate word echo. Similarly, I will talk about both the Maze prison and the H blocks. Republicans tend to prefer the term Long Kesh or the H blocks in the case of cellular confinement. I mean no judgment by any of this. I'm just trying to alleviate the word echo here since I'll use those terms quite a bit. So in March of 1976, the IRA issued a policy statement. Okay? This is on the eve of special category status being removed, where they stated, already, volunteers have been instructed that they are not to engage in any institutional schemes under the control of the prison administration. They are further instructed that they are not to wear any clothing provided by the prison, even if such clothes are of a civilian type. True to their word, then, the first Republicans imprisoned under the new policy of criminalization launched a protest to be recognized as political prisoners. When 19-year-old Kieran Nugent became the first IRA man sentenced after the removal of special category status, he was subsequently taken to the new cellular accommodation in the H blocks, or Maze Cellular, where he refused the prison uniform and symbolically the status of criminal that came with it, wrapping himself in the blanket instead. The ensuing blanket protest had very important symbolic dimensions. 20th century Western prisons in general, and Northern Ireland was no exception to this, were designed specifically to be sites of order and conformity, particularly order and conformity as defined from above, that is, by the guards and prison administrations. This included a type of visual order, in addition to ideas of behavioral order. Uniforms were therefore a very important part of that regime. And the uniform, in conjunction with devices like prison numbers and regimented schedules, were ways in which prisons undermined individuality in the service of order and conformity. Personal clothing, on the other hand, is one of the ways that we can express our individuality. And interestingly, at least one official at the Northern Ireland office understood this, and in fact took that idea a step further. In December of 1975, he wrote, "I am aware that the requirement to wear a prison uniform is widely regarded as an important aspect of prison discipline. I have never quite understood why. It may be a woolly liberal approach, but it has always seemed to me that the prison uniform is one of the dehumanizing aspects of prison life, and I think on merits, there's a case to say that prisoners should be allowed to be either comfortable or smart in clothing of their own choice." This, however, was not the prevailing attitude of most of the NIO, ensuring that the uniform would remain a flashpoint of protest. The other important aspect of uniforms that I want to express here is that they defined both the people that were considered offenders and those that were part of the prison hierarchy, the guards. And in fact, the uniforms established a hierarchy between those two groups. It was the guards who were supposed to define the behaviors which constituted order in the prison environment. The blanket protest was a constant reminder that guards were unable to do so in major ways. It reoriented the visual space of the prison to one where prisoners, or at least the Republican movement, defined their own presentation of their bodies, creating the new identity of blanket men. There were also modest tangible gains from the blanket protest, most notably in terms of outside support. In Belfast on Easter Monday in 1976, a group formed who stated that their purpose was, quote, "to break the wall of silence surrounding the issue of POWs fighting for political status." The group was composed of prisoner relations and quickly became known then as the Relatives Action Committee, or RAC. More RACs were subsequently created, mainly in and around Belfast in this early moment. And when Kieran Nugent initiated the blanket protest in September, the RAC's purpose really came into focus and they rallied behind the blanket men. They had great difficulty, though, gaining publicity initially, which confined them largely to Republican neighborhoods, but they laid the foundation for later activism on behalf of the prisoners, which would continue to develop as the Republicans' campaign against criminalization progressed. Now, after a year, so into 1977, over 300 men had joined Nugent on the blanket and refused to conform to the new regime. This was enough to fill H blocks 3, 4, and 5, labeled on the slide in front of you there, while women sentenced to Armagh jail were refusing prison work in their own action against criminalization. Nevertheless, after a year, this phase of the protest had gained little ground with the authorities. I'll give you one example here. Because non-cooperation with the prison authorities was viewed as a sort of crime against the prison regime, blanket men were punished with cellular confinement while on the blanket. This caused an NIO official to remark, quote, "Ironically, the workload on the discipline staff is much reduced because of the protesters' self-imposed cellular confinement." And the Northern Ireland office wrote further that they were prepared to simply wait the Republicans out. In November of 1977, however, Stanley Hilditch, governor of HMP Mays Cellular, issued Governor's Order number 22 at the behest of the NIO's Director of Prisons Operations. He ordered that prisoners had 3 options when it came to attending Mass, medical visits, exercise and library facilities, slopping out, and using the ablutions. This is the layout of an H block. You can see that something like the wash house and toilets are a fair distance away from something like C or D wing, depending on where prisoners were in cells. He stated that as of the 20th of November, prisoners could partake in those activities: 1, wearing the prison uniform; 2, wearing prison underwear; or 3, nothing at all. Wearing the blanket was no longer an option. He maintained that this was an attempt to encourage prisoners to, quote, appear in a seemly manner while moving about the prison. Again, the visual regime here is paramount, but blanket men saw a choice between accepting the classification of a criminal or humiliation and vulnerability at the hands of prison officers. Having denied guards that original opportunity to assert superiority in the prison hierarchy when they refused the uniform, Republicans complained that warders attempted to establish dominance by beating and harassing prisoners in the corridors of the H blocks instead. By refusing to leave their cells, prisoners could avoid most activities that required a uniform, and they could establish a relatively safe and autonomous space, but were nonetheless left with the problem then of eliminating waste. When in March of 1978, guards first refused to allow Republican prisoners to empty their chamber pots without uniform, the dirty protests began. The purposes of that protest were fourfold. In the first place, refusing to leave cells to wash or slop out served the very practical purpose of keeping the blanket men from situations where their vulnerability could be exploited. Secondly, escalating the protest gave volunteers a morale boost, as we'll see in just a moment. Thirdly, the escalation of the protest would refocus the public's gaze, on the prisons, which could bring additional pressure to bear on the Northern Ireland office to reinstate special category status. Finally, the no wash protest allowed Republicans to maintain key aspects of their view of how the prison should operate. Crucially, they could continue to refuse the prison uniform and the badge of criminality that it carried. Protesting prisoners initially intensified their protests on a weekly basis. Having refused to wash, they refused to change their sheets. Describing this moment, this early aspect of the protest, a blanket man recalled, we felt that we were winning, and we, for a change, not the screws, had control over our lives because we dictated the pace of events. The screws, for their part, were demoralized because they had no control over what happened next. Because Hilditch's order prohibited prisoners from slopping out in their blankets, the blanket men smashed their windows and emptied the contents of their chamber pots out the windows and under the doors. But protesting prisoners very quickly complained that guards soaked their cells with high-powered hoses from outside when they were washing waste off the outside of the blocks, and often threw waste back into the cells while blanket men slept. This led the blanket men to begin to smear their cell walls with excrement. The dirty protest very soon extended to protesting prisoners across H3, 4, and 5, creating lasting repercussions for the prison system. Prison warders, speaking under condition of anonymity, confessed if they hadn't brought in the steam cleaning, they would have had to give way on the special category because the medical people were on the point of closing the whole thing down as a health hazard. In intensifying their actions beyond the symbolic significance of the blanket protest by smearing feces, the blanket protesters demonstrated and turned their cells into physical representations of their antagonism toward the policy of criminalization. For blanket men, though, it was more than simply a protest. It was the only way forward if they were to remain true to their ideological commitments. Almost immediately, as I think we can probably surmise, the dirty protest upset the prison regime by creating an increased number of non-cooperating prisoners. As part of their bid for political status and to repudiate the badge of the criminal, protesting Republicans had, since 1976 and the start of the blanket protest, refused to engage in prison work. Guards consequently tasked loyalist prisoners to act as orderlies, but when Republicans began fouling their cells, loyalists refused to clean them, leaving that work to the guards. At times, more than 200 loyalists protested en masse against such work, and by 1980, 19 were permanently refusing to work, and 11 others had joined Republicans in what they referred to very specifically as the clean blanket protest. This came as something of a surprise for the NIO, whose memos in the run-up to the revocation of special category status argued that they had very little to worry about from loyalists in terms of protest. In this manner, non-conforming Republicans in H3, H4, and H5 consequently recreated the workforce in those blocks and generated more work for the prison officers forced to take over. Significantly, loyalists and Republicans both protesting and protesting in the same direction meant that two otherwise hostile communities were united against an already beleaguered prison government. And these new responsibilities for prison officers were not without their own problems. An ex-prison welfare officer remembered that warders felt defiled after their shifts, and it took them hours to get the smell out of their clothes, that the protest extended into their private lives, their bodies, their sense of cleanliness, their marital relations, and their relations to children, to their children. According to the welfare officer, a guard who worked 12 hours in the protesting blocks would spend approximately 4 hours trying to remove the smell from his clothing and body before returning to work a mere 12 hours later. Thus, in April of 1978, guards working in the H blocks refused to wear their uniforms home or even bring them home after changing. Just 1 month after the blanket protest escalated into the no wash protest, prisoners dictated who performed the least desirable jobs in prison and stamped the bodies of their guards with their protest, which led then to officers abandoning prison protocol by not wearing their uniforms home, which put them into conflict with the NIO. The visual breakdown of prison order was just the beginning of further confrontations between the guards and the NIO as protests against criminalization continued. Throughout those protests, the government had to contend with antagonistic prisoners and prison employees who were equally disgruntled with the system. Now, not only were protesting IRA and INLA prisoners refusing their uniforms, they effectively dictated what guards wore and did not wear, forcing prison officers into hazmat suits, like you see in front of you. In an institution designed to isolate prisoners, dirty protests established themselves as a cohesive unit whose actions isolated the guards from outside communities and at times even limited their contact with the air. When then Archbishop Tommaso Fee visited the H blocks in late July 1978, his reaction to the protest put further pressure on the NIO. In that now famous comparison between the, quote, inhuman conditions prevailing in H blocks 3, 4, and 5 to hundreds of homeless people living in the sewer pipes of the slums of Calcutta, Fee demanded that privileges be restored to protesting prisoners without delay. He reasoned that physical exercise, association with other prisoners, contact with the outside world were, quote, basic human needs for physical and mental health, not privileges to be granted or withheld as rewards or punishments. His words reflected Republican prisoners' call for a regime based not on punishment or criminalization, but on the idea that they were captured combatants of war. For their part, in public, the Northern Ireland office maintained the opposite stance, but internal communications revealed less confidence. In the immediate aftermath of O'Fee's statement, the NIO reminded the public that more than 80 of the protesting prisoners were serving sentences for murder or attempted murder. Upwards of 80 more had been sentenced for explosive offenses. that these men were, at the very least, members of organizations responsible for the deaths of hundreds of innocent people, and the punishment kneecappings of over 600 others. They further stressed that the blanket men brought these conditions on themselves and could thus alleviate them at any moment. In confidential correspondence in October, however, NIO officials debated staying the course or implementing further changes to the prison system. One official cautioned, "The regime that is being administered is not one designed for a long, drawn-out struggle. Humanitarian concern makes the present regime vulnerable, especially if something goes suddenly wrong, and humanitarian concern can turn into political pressure." Secretary of State Roy Mason's first response was to guess that if prisoners were given any concessions, they would simply push for more, but he did agree to look into the situation further. Later, he admitted that for the government, Ophis' visit and his speech, quote, was a disaster. And protesting prisoners through these moments were beginning to make then the NIO and May's administration reevaluate their stance toward those prisoners. Even beyond the Archbishop, support for the protesters was growing. Relatives Action Committees proliferated across Northern Ireland in 1978, forming a central coordinating committee by mid-year. In August, on the 10th anniversary of the first Civil Rights March, all the RACs came together to support another march from Coal Island to Dungannon. Republicans estimated that over 25,000 people turned up for that event, a number 10 times that of the original civil rights protest. In October 1979, following a Smash H-Block conference held in West Belfast, a 17-member committee was elected to spearhead a national campaign to push for political status. Later named the National H-Block Armagh Committee, the bulk of the committee was made up of people close to or part of Sinn Féin, but the Irish Republican Socialist Party and People's Democracy were also represented. They would become crucial to the support mobilized for the later hunger strikes. Again, however, they came into being during this earlier phase of the prison protests. And as you see from the front page of the Irish People there, they were through 1978 and into 1979, the RACs and then the National H-Block Armagh Committee having success in terms of drawing people to demonstrations. Meanwhile, there was to be no respite from pressure on the government officials because in August of 1979, the rupture between the NIO and prison workers surfaced again. That month, the Prison Officers Association, or POA, which was the guards' trade union, requested medical facilities for warders who were exposed to the chemicals that were used to clean dirty protest cells. 9 months previously, 4 staff members had complained of skin rashes, but the NIO noted that they had never followed up with prison doctors or their own general practitioners. They surmised that the prison officers didn't want to lose the extra 4 pounds a day that they received for working in the protesting blocks. At a meeting in May, prison doctors informed NIO officials that there were no health risks to officers working the dirty protest, and the NIO used guards' extra pay as well as the fact that showers were available to them to say that the officers had no cause to complain. In August then, the NIO further contended that doctors' duties should not be expanded to include the occupational and industrial health of prison staff. Thus, as the protests wore on, labor relations between the Prison Officers Association and the NIO became increasingly tense, the former making demands essentially that the latter refused to concede. And increasingly, those demands focused on monetary compensation for guards in the protesting H-blocks. That struggle for money not only created tensions between the Prison Officers Association and the NIO, but also between the guards in the maze and warders in other prisons. For instance, minutes for a February 1980 meeting noted that the NIO prisons minister was engaged in negotiations with the POA over their emergency allowance yet again. And although a committee formed to look into the matter had recommended no additional pay, the government said that they offered what they described as a, quote, substantial increase that nevertheless fell short of the POA's demands. The officials at that meeting really had to content themselves with the fact that it seemed at that time that prison officials had, quote, no great appetite for industrial action. However, at the same time, noting the extra money that had already been given to those working in the protesting blocks, guards in other prisons began to jealously refer to H-block warders as, quote, May's millionaires. And those conflicts continued to simmer while prisoners once again upped the ante. This time, the escalation came from the women imprisoned in Armagh jail, who initiated their own no-wash protest early in 1980. Their protest began, government officials declared, in response to a cell search where guards uncovered several IRA uniforms and paramilitary flags. You can see examples of those being used by prisoners in that photo of a commemoration in A-Wing exercise yard. Prisoners themselves, though, stated that following the search, Governor George Scott imported male guards from the H blocks who proceeded to beat them. They reported that their dirty protests started when Governor Scott ordered that the toilets be locked, had the women transferred to a lower floor of the prison. You can see the levels of the prison there on the slide, where they found their windows covered and the spy holes in their doors boarded over. With the commencement of the women's action, Republicans forced the NIO and prison authorities to fight on two fronts. NIO officials were already complaining that the Mays could not continue to operate in this manner when the women added fresh energy to the campaign against criminalization and widened the field of battle. As in the H blocks, orderlies who were made up of the few short-term male prisoners at Armagh refused to clean the wings. They feared that if they cooperated and cleaned, they were in danger of being shot by the IRA upon their release. And violence related to the prisons was escalating at this time. Having already killed one prison warder in 1974, with the advent of the fight against criminalization 2 years later, Republicans deemed prison officers to be legitimate targets. During the dirty protest, these attacks became more frequent. Republicans killed 6 corrections officers before the dirty protest, 3 in 1976 and 3 more in 1977. Between 1978 and 1979, however, that number leapt to 12. This total included the assistant governors of both the Mays and Crumlin Road Jail, and Republicans killed 2 more prison officers in the first months of 1980. In targeting prison officers, the IRA and INLA marked those men and women as different from other members of the population and drew guards still further into the world that they were creating, this time with very deadly consequences. By February of 1980, then, the Northern Ireland office was faced with 2 prisons where Republicans effectively dictated everyday operations in protesting areas. Prison officers were forced to accept distasteful working conditions that isolated them from families and communities, and guards were now subject to assassination by the IRA and INLA. But the sexed dirtiness of the protest at Armagh meant that women faced challenges gaining support for their protest, even from the Republican movement. The IRA women prisoners second in command remembered that the dirty protest in Armagh was met with horror by the outside world and confided that she could understand that revulsion. It was bad enough that for 2 years, the men in the H blocks had lived amidst their own urine and feces, but, she said, add to that menstruation, soiled sanitary towels, and tampons, and even I can get the stomach-churning sense of how people felt. Reared as many Republicans had been in Catholic households, the menstrual cycle was taboo. Another ex-Armagh prisoner described the situation, saying, "In Ireland, you don't speak about your period. You don't even mention the word. My mother hardly ever mentioned it to us, and we were a family of 8 girls and 1 boy." The women, therefore, had 2 hurdles to jump: their struggle against the prison regime and their erasure by a populace not prepared to discuss the quote-unquote dirt that their bodies produced. The process whereby Republicans came to support the Armagh women vocally and openly revealed the growing place of women within the larger Republican movement. Women in Armagh knew that not everyone on the outside of the prison would understand or support their reasoning for beginning a dirty protest. They knew that male guards cleaning up after female prisoners subverted gendered expectations of the roles of men and women, and that this would be difficult for many in outside communities to accept. Yet they did start a no-wash protest, forcing Republicans, at least, to begin to abandon older ideas about gender and support them, or damage the Republican cause by denying that women were in the right. Choosing the latter would have been disastrous, and Republicans consolidated their support behind the women. So heavily did Republicans publicize the women's protest that by April 1980, the NIO worried that it was Armagh, not the H blocks, that had, quote, become the main focus of the Provisionals' propaganda campaign. One of the effects of the women's protests then was increased publicity for the prisoners, which helped bring women's issues to the fore and ultimately led to a larger, more cohesive front with which Republicans could fight the prison regime. Of course, by asserting their right to protest, women at Armagh had not stumbled over some panacea for fraught gender relations. Many scholars note that Republicans levied support for their cause by publicizing the plight of helpless girls forced into disgusting conditions by a callous government and a brutal prison regime, rather than praising the actions of capable women. While that characterization was abundant, for Republican women, that situation reflected their contention that the road to gender equality was through a united Irish Republic. For these women, gender issues were important, but gender equality could not be achieved without the Republican struggle itself, the belief being that the gender hierarchy was the result of the British system. So full equality, they said, would emerge under the new government of a united Irish Republic when the final remnants of political and cultural ties to Britain had finally been purged from the Irish people. The women in Armagh, imprisoned as they were for actions to further the cause of an independent Irish Republic, thus argued that they were at the forefront of the fight for gender equality. So I think that we have to accept that although the women at Armagh were sometimes criticized by feminists themselves for the ways that they did and did not challenge gender hierarchies, these women attacked those gender hierarchies and norms in ways that made sense to their ideological orientation and lived experience. By maintaining that an Irish Republic was the way to equality in the face of other feminists and scholars who denied this, Republican women proved themselves to have the agency and power that was being denied them. Also, in transferring guards from the H blocks to Armagh, prison officers' job descriptions changed once again, fueling that push for higher wages and intensifying the animosity between guards and the NIO. Forcing guards to work amidst feces, urine, and now menstrual blood at Armagh, the women increased an already wide schism initially created by the men in the H blocks between guards and the rest of Northern Irish society. I think it's important, though, that we examine men's and women's protests together as equal forces if we really want to understand the process by which Republicans changed the prison regime and undercut criminalization. Studying the protests together proves that the drive for political status was larger than a few malcontents in a single prison and could not be solved simply by allowing prisoners access to their own clothes, as that NIO official hoped that I mentioned earlier in the talk. The women, after all, had continued to be allowed their own clothing after 1976, but still refused to cooperate with the prison regime and resorted to a dirty protest, as the men had done. It was men and women then together who worked to upset prison governments and challenge criminalization. By examining their actions at the same time, we can understand the full effects of the No Wash protest and how stress on the government and prisons was compounded by two prisons protesting simultaneously. Support for the prisoners and pressure on the NIO grew still further when images of both men and women protesting in the H blocks and Armagh emerged, shocking many outside. If the condemnation from the Archbishop of Armagh wasn't enough to make Catholic communities sympathize with the prisoners, the first pictures of dirty protesters smuggled from the H blocks, showing men with long hair and beards and evoking divine comparisons were. You can see in this particular picture that both men are wearing crucifixes. There's rosary beads hanging on the window. Those were some of the few possessions that blanket men were allowed to keep in their cell. The earliest reports coming from relatives of inmates decried the plight of prisoners on moral Christian grounds. In Anderson's Town News's first front page story on the No Wash protest, the wife of an H block protester lamented, quote, "The sickening aspect of the whole matter is that this barbaric treatment is being sanctioned and implemented by people who profess to be Christian." When the Archbishop laid the blame for the conditions in the H blocks at the feet of the prisons and the NIO, the protest was joined even more closely to the sufferings that defined the church. Then, in October of 1980, the BBC's Newsnight program ran a report on the protests. The picture on this slide and the last picture were both stills from that report. Where the IRA had previously smuggled photos out of the prison to their own communities, now images of bearded men with shoulder-length hair standing barefoot in filthy cells with hardly anything but blankets were broadcast to a much wider audience. BBC reporters were not allowed to talk to the protesters, merely film them. But the blanket men yelled to the cameras that they were political prisoners. That's what's happening in this picture. And the haunting images of young men with shredded mattresses, rosaries, and gaunt faces were enough. The dirty protesters became Christ-like figures revered and respected in Republican communities who garnered sympathy in the larger world. This was one of the most exciting moments of my week. I very recently found this particular quote to exemplify this. Artist Richard Hamilton, writing in 1983, said, "What we had heard of the blanket protest, mainly through the propaganda agencies of Sinn Féin, could not prepare us for the startling photographic documentation on TV. The picture presented first by Granada Television and later by the BBC was shocking less for its scatological content than for its potency. An oft-declared British view of the IRA as thugs and hooligans did not match the materialization of Christian martyrdom so profoundly contained on film. One became acutely aware of the religious conflict that had resulted in the civil inequalities that gave a platform for IRA activity. The symbols of Christ's agony were there, not only the crucifix on the neck of the prisoners and the rosary, which confirmed the monastic austerity, but the self-inflicted suffering which has marked Christianity from the earliest times." The blanket men here were rendered martyrs to a cause, not criminals. And indeed, it's the image of the dirty protester with long, shaggy hair and beard, which is often used in evocative Republican imagery from and referring to this period. Incidentally, that Irish Republican Socialist Party booklet that's pictured on the left there is one of the photocopies I made during my research in the Northern Ireland Political Collection at the Lennon Hall Library. On the other hand, when a photograph of Mairead Farrell in her feces and menstrual blood stained cell was surreptitiously taken and smuggled out of Armagh prison, otherwise supportive communities revealed a sort of paralysis in trying to deal with the image and its implications. In Republican communities, the woman in struggle, in addition sometimes being seen as a helpless girl, has often been portrayed as a suffering mother, akin to the Virgin Mary. Here was suffering, but suffering that was associated with a woman's menstrual cycle, a taboo subject literally spread on the wall. It was difficult for many people to apply that to a protest against being labeled criminal, but the images, along with others taken at Armagh, did gain relatively widespread circulation, and the women at Armagh were, in the words of one former prisoner, quote, delighted to hear how successful they were. So far from accepting invisibility, the photograph of Farrell has become one of the most enduring images of the campaign for political status. It took about a decade from the time that the art of the dirty protester in the H blocks made it to a British museum, but an image of Mairead Farrell in her dirty protest cell is also now in a British art museum. And then in October of 1980, with the breakdown of order in 2 prisons and feeling that they needed to intensify the protest once more to win concessions, the IRA announced that 7 men in the H blocks would begin a hunger strike. 3 women joined them in December. And it was in the midst of that situation that the Prison Officers Association finally decided to embark on industrial action. Now, the sources are somewhat contradictory here, full disclosure, that sources from the NIO and Westminster attribute that Northern Irish action to solidarity with the Prison Officers Association, who was engaged in industrial action in England and Wales at the time. Journalist Chris Ryder, though, as well as former Mays prison officers themselves, remembered that they acted based on their own interests, suggesting that the POA in Northern Ireland was motivated by the refusal of the government to grant an increase in their emergency allowance. Whatever the reason, guards banned the reception of prisoners coming in from the courts and remand hearings, and they refused to escort prisoners to court or assist in the transfer of prisoners between prisons. They were now in conflict with the courts as well as with the NIO. And there were an increasing number of men and women with nowhere to go upon sentencing or the conclusion of their trial. The government was subsequently forced to set up a temporary prison, HMP Foyle, which was run by police to accommodate new prisoners. Thus, as Republicans began the first of 2 hunger strikes in October of 1980, the NIO was faced with a situation where 2 of the North's most notorious prisons had seen visual discipline erode as cells were fouled and warders discarded their uniforms before leaving. The number of non-conforming prisoners increased as loyalists and other orderlies refused prison duties. An outside movement of support for political status grew. Here you see people demonstrating in support of the women hunger strikers at Armagh. And relations between the POA and the government degraded. In fighting a regime that classified them as isolated criminals, Republican prisoners formed a cohesive front and distanced themselves from the ODCs, the ordinary decent criminals, in the most graphic way imaginable. Although it took the hunger strikes to win something closer to their ultimate demands, Republicans had taken the blanket protest, which the NIO felt, quote, could go on indefinitely, and created a situation that was untenable. This is not to say, I should add a caution here, that protesters necessarily knew of all the havoc that they wrought or could have kept the dirty protest going indefinitely. The dirty protest, the beatings that came with it, took a considerable amount of mental stamina to live through, and there was a constant danger of people breaking under the strain and leaving the protest. That in part led to the decision to embark on hunger strike to begin with. But as long as a core of protesters remained, they kept the NIO and prison officials on the wrong foot and continued to build support for their movement. Effectively, a united front of Republican protesters ensured that their inhuman conditions prevailed in the fight against criminalization. When the first hunger strike concluded with what the prisoners believed to be a deal to wear their own clothes, the mood in support of communities outside the prison was high. Quickly turned to anger at the prison authorities and the government when prisoners received civilian type clothing only. To Republicans, this was just another prison uniform. Prisoners then decided to end their no-wash protest, which had continued through the 1980 hunger strike, and channel their anger into a second hunger strike in which 10 men died during the spring and summer of 1981. I include this picture because these were photographs of hunger strikers that were taken on the day that they launched their hunger strike. And we can see in them the dirty protest come to an end. Bobby Sands, who began his hunger strike on March 1st, 1981, we can see still has the long hair and beard associated with dirty protesters. Everyone else who started their hunger strike afterward has had haircuts and shave. When this hunger strike began, though, the support apparatus was already in place to publicize the hunger strikers' cause. Moreover, the government of Northern Ireland by this time had worked for nearly 4 years to maintain labor relations with its prison staff and to keep sympathy from shifting to the men and women that they tried to classify as criminal. In this, they would be unsuccessful. And so here I'm going to explain briefly what I mean when I've been saying that criminalization was undermined. Following the ending of the 1981 hunger strike, Secretary of State James Pryor announced a series of changes to prison policy applicable to all prisoners. Prisoners could wear their own clothes. They could enjoy free association between neighboring wings in each H block, the exercise and recreation rooms. The number of visits allowed was increased, and prisoners were eligible for up to 50% of their lost remission. Meanwhile, the 10 who died on hunger strike joined the Republican pantheon. Although not always acknowledged by scholars, the blanket and dirty protests were a key component to the shift in prison order. And that shift in prison order meant that criminalization, as it emerged on March 1st, 1976, only extended to early October of 1981. After that, the prisons were fundamentally different. Gable walls, such as this one in Rome, which was created very recently, rebel songs, they remember this latter phase of the protests, the hunger strikes. But it was during the earlier blanket and no-wash stages that Republicans established the foundation for those hunger strikes. These fasts were the zenith of 5 years of ever-escalating protest in support of political status, and they reaped the benefits of those earlier actions. Many of the hunger strikers, all of the hunger strikers, in fact, were part of those earlier actions as well, it should be said. The 1981 hunger strike was a watershed moment in Republicanism that cannot be denied. But events like Sinn Féin's turn to the Armalite and ballot box strategy and the demise of criminalization did not spring from the ether when Frank Maguire died, leaving his vacant parliamentary seat for hunger strike leader Bobby Sands to fill. Republican protesters established a basis for these changes with the buildup of unbearable stress within the prisons and the creation of a large support base, so that when Republicans finally targeted the government demanding change from above, from the government itself, the situation in the prisons had already been altered in key ways in favor of Republican prisoners. So that is where I will end the talk today. If we have time, I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Rachel. That was really fascinating. No questions have come through the chat function at the moment, but I am confident enough in our audience that if anyone wants to ask a question, they can unmute themselves and ask it. I don't often allow this privilege, Normally, we're very strict about making people go through the chat function, but I think there's 20 of us. A few people joined during your talk there, Rachel. But if anybody does have a question, feel free, please, just to unmute yourselves and ask it there. Okay, I'll maybe ask one then to start. Maybe people are a bit shy whenever this happens. You mentioned one or two things that you had used from the Northern Ireland political collection at the Linen Hall. Can you give us an idea of some other things that people might find if they were to sort of embark on a research project such as yours? Like, what sort of material were you looking for at the Linen Hall whenever you were researching this?
Absolutely. So I showed you the booklet cover. I'll go back to it here for just a second. There we go. From the IRSP, found a lot of things like this: booklets, pamphlets, material produced by people who were looking to support the prisoners, but also by also literature that was produced by the government, literature that was produced by prison officers that told essentially their angle of these moments. There were also really fascinating documents that I looked at that were in the prisons and the hunger strike boxes in the political collection that talked about the families and talked about people who had no connection to the prisons at all, but were nevertheless living through this time and thus had reactions, were experiencing things that researchers then put on paper. And sometimes these were academics, sometimes these were just other people in communities who were looking to make sure their stories were told. The Northern Ireland political collection is really invaluable, I think, in terms of getting to what people who were not connected to the government thought. Okay. The government is also there as well, but if you're looking for people who lived through this, I think the political collection is a great place to start and a great place to go. When I was doing research for my master's thesis, I was looking particularly at the civil rights movement, and there's just endless amounts of material related to civil rights in Northern Ireland. There's a huge collection of newspapers that come from times past, and that can show you how the press was reacting to these things. So I think that the collection is incredible, and really you can find so much there that would be useful to any sort of research project that dealt with these years.
That's great, Rachel. It's really useful because I'm conscious that there's a lot of people on this session who probably aren't even from Northern Ireland and probably haven't visited the Linen Hall Library before. I don't know if you've seen it, but recently we rediscovered, someone did advise me that we had a prison communication, the prison communication, which ended the hunger strike. I don't know if you've seen that. And I showed it to Tom Hartley. It wasn't donated by Tom Hartley. I don't know how we came to have it. It's written on the tiniest handwriting on the tiniest piece of paper. The top paragraphs in the Irish language and the rest is in English, and it basically instructs the prisoners to end the hunger strike at a particular time on a particular given day. And I showed it to Tom Hartley, and his jaw hit the floor. Tom Hartley obviously was a former Sinn Féin Lord Mayor and editor of An Fóblad magazine throughout the Troubles, and his first reaction to me was, make sure you get that insured. Absolutely priceless piece of information that we have there. I just come out of, as you say, one of those prison communication boxes that we have, just labeled prison communications, and just hundreds of these things in it, and buried within it was this piece of treasure. I can see someone.
Absolutely incredible.
Someone has their hand up there. I didn't quite see who it was. Patricia?
Yes.
Do you have a question?
Rachel, thank you very much. I found your talk fascinating. I wonder, I mean, this might seem a bit naive, but the population that you're talking about who were protesting, were they all people who were kind of signed up to, say, the IRA or the IRSP? I'm saying that because internment people were scooped up who weren't, you know, scooped up for any old reason, really. I think that is established as a fact. So I just wondered, had that maybe hardened up some people who weren't in a paramilitary organization, and did they then go on to be part of this movement of protest?
It's a good question. To my knowledge, by the time you get to the era of criminalization and the move to cellular confinement in the H blocks, as opposed to the Nissen huts that were used for special category prisoners and for the internees, those divisions do harden, that people on the protest from 1976 to 1981 or any part therein were all directly connected to one or another of Republican groups. That meant that sometimes there was a little bit of conflict there and a little bit of tension between, say, the Provisional IRA and the INLA. But generally then they came together for these sorts of protests. But you're absolutely right that in that earlier moment and through internment, there was this issue of people being scooped up, particularly in the internment swoops of 1971, that were not connected to any sort of paramilitary group, but who, for political reasons, were included in that sort of thing. Yeah, I'm sort of racking my brain here, but I can't think of anyone who is particularly noted in any of the primary source documents that I looked at who were not involved with one of those organizations that was on protest. But I mean, certainly exceptions, I think, could have existed, but I don't think they were the norm.
Thank you, Rachel. We have it's like a sing-song here. Everyone wants to join in at the end, like a sing-song in a pub. We've got 2 questions down the chat function, and I can see Kieran McConaughey has his hand up. So what I'll do is we'll treat these as the last 3 questions, because I think we've worked you hard enough, Rachel, okay, and we've slightly overshot our time. So the first question in the chat function's from Emily, who asks, she says, "Hi, Rachel. Curious on your thoughts as to why these protests haven't received the attention in the research world that the hunger strike protests have."
I love this question, but well, I love all the questions, I should say, but I like this one. My instinct here is that historians, academics are a little bit prude. That this isn't sort of nice dinner time conversation that you can have, and they've sort of shied away from that. I think the other half of that is that the hunger strikes, particularly 1981, are so instrumental to what comes next that they really overshadow these earlier protests. You can see in the mural from 2011 that has dirty protesters in the center, they're surrounded by the 10 hunger strikers who died in 1981 and 2 hunger strikers who died in 74 and 76 respectively in English jails, so that these earlier protests really get subsumed into this moment of 80 and 81 and the hunger strikes and what they did as well.
Thanks, Rachel. And I hope that answers your question, Emily. Let me ask the next one from the chat function, which is from Denise, and then we'll finish with Kieran, if that's okay. So this one's from Denise. Does Rachel know if this type of no-wash protest has been used anywhere else in the world, and how does it compare with the Northern Ireland experience?
Yeah, so there have been moments that have been compared to it, and I'm most familiar with the American situation. My dissertation is actually comparative between prisons in Northern Ireland and in the United States. That the United States makes very heavy use of solitary confinement, and guards and prison administrations with fair regularity complain that prisoners in solitary confinement have just gone into animalistic ways of operating, by which they are talking about, and they will then go on to explicitly express the fact that they're smearing feces on the walls, that they are throwing feces at warders, this sort of thing. There is a later action that is called a dirty protest in Maghaberry in Northern Ireland itself. I don't know that anywhere has explicitly said, prisoners anywhere have explicitly said, we are now embarking on a no wash or dirty protest, though similar actions have occurred in different places.
Thanks, Rachel. Kieran, over to you, my friend. Make it a good one. This is the last one.
Bit of an anticlimax, but Denise got in there with that excellent question, which was the same as mine. And so thanks, Rachel, for already answering that question.
No problem. No problem.
Great. Well, then
thank you again, everyone.
You've brought my conclusion forward then by a minute or two. But look, folks, thanks for making this a very easy session to host. Thank you, Rachel, for joining us. I know you're in the middle of the day where you are. Thanks to Tony for recommending you. Yes, Tony, you can see you. Good to see you, mate. And thanks to everyone for joining us. I know that a lot of you aren't from Belfast, aren't from Northern Ireland. This may even be your first and may even be your last engagement with the Linenhall Library. Hopefully not. I would encourage you to go onto our website, www.linenhall.com. You'll be able to see what other events we're running between now and September. Actually, most of our events have been published. Some of them will be online, so you'll be able to tune into those if any of those take your fancy. Again, as I say, this has been recorded. I'll maybe follow up with a little email tomorrow after I speak with Rachel if we do get this uploaded, and then you can share it with any of your friends and colleagues who maybe missed out on this evening's session. So look, folks, that's all from me. Just to say thanks again, and I'll hopefully see some, if not all of you, in the very near future. So take care.
Thank you all.